The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today with ACCA members in the Middle East, even if it is not in person, to welcome two excellent presenters of this workshop on using scenario analysis for a sustainable future. I'm Rachel Johnson, Head of Risk Management and Corporate Governance for ACCA's Professional Insights. We are the team at ACCA who advocates, conducts research, thought leadership, and other continuous learning content for our members around the world. I asked the presenters here today whether they would kindly create a workshop on scenario analysis because A, I saw them both present before in such an amazingly practical and interactive way, and B, ACCA members, many of whom are here in the Middle East, who are in charge of risk from a range in a range of various roles across cities in the Middle East, they tell us that they would appreciate more practical support on how to identify emerging risks, be able to measure all the intangibles that we deal with today more accurately, and plan better given all these moving parts. This is not easy given the existential and geopolitical aspects of the risk landscape that we're facing today, not least with how we all are affected by the devastating crisis in Ukraine and its accelerating inflationary pressures and risks on the supply and cost of goods around the world. Once again, we have seen how the velocity and context of global risk can change dramatically within a matter of days, if not hours. Members talk to me about the questions they have had to ask themselves and their teams about the potential threats and what ifs. And the one thing clear is that we need to look beyond the past and provide more analysis about what is ahead, provide more foresight about what our expected and unexpected losses look like. We need to do this if we are to remain relevant or have any success at steering organizations in the right direction. Indeed, when we first talked about this session on scenario analysis, COP26 had just come out, and the world was digesting what regulators, investors, lenders, and companies and their stakeholders were doing in their role in fighting climate change and the urgencies around reaching net zero, protecting people on the planet from further devastation. The release of the IPCC report last week provided us with a dire warning of the threats we face, and unless we act on the more frequent and severe extreme weather and the intertwined hazards it all is causing. ACCA members working with even the most mature risk governance frameworks have confided in us that they do not have the alignment that they thought they did, that sustainability and resiliency means different things to different teams across the organization, and that they're struggling with all the different reporting requirements, and of course how they ensure the integrity of the disclosures, and make sure that the transition risks and opportunities in between are being addressed. Everyone seems to have a story about how the various green color-coded risks on their register proved to be some of the most material, and how they never appreciated the interconnectedness of all these existential emerging risks. Members have told us too how they have had to work with teams and other stakeholders more than ever to make sense of what is to come, what risks matter most to their organization, and what they should do about these potential outcomes. These are extraordinary times, and the things we put in and out of our models need new thinking by all of those who are involved across the three lines. This requires a lot of questions not asked before, a lot of collaboration to understand what information we might already be sitting on or what further data we might need to gather if we are to understand the various scenarios and how to plan for them. So before introducing the presenters, I'd like to invite you to please enter any questions you might have for the presenters into the questions box. I will be adding some relevant links in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm so delighted to introduce you first to Jane Waldy. She's a fellow ACCA member who also sits on our Global Forum for Governance, Risk and Performance. Her contribution to the forum and our profession in general since I've joined the ACCA has been very much appreciated. Jane has held senior finance roles, including financial controller for Shell International Renewables. She also worked in risk management at Anglo American, focusing on embedding risk management in bulk commodity trading, and at Anglo American's Safety and Sustainability Department, she worked on understanding safety and sustainability risks, analyzing and reporting on controls and risk status too. As group head for Informa PLC here in the UK, she designed and embedded a new risk policy and framework, improved risk culture and maturity, the understanding of risk appetite and tolerance, and embedded stronger risk governance and clearer, verifiable internal risk reporting. Jane now works as an independent risk consultant for the holistic risk practice and is associate at Citarla. So I'm also grateful to be welcoming Dr. Sarah Gordon, who is co-founder and CEO of Citarla Risk and Sustainability Management. And I'll put the link to Citarla in the chat. She's also co-founder of Responsible Raw Materials, which I'll also paste in the chat box. She is a certified trainer for the Institute of Risk Management and lectures at Imperial College London, as well as the University of Johannesburg. Having started her career as an exploration geologist before moving into sustainability and risk management, she has always been passionate about ensuring that we make sustainability a reality. Sarah, in fact, represented the Geological Society at COP26 in Glasgow last November and is a member of the UK Government Expert Committee on Raw Materials. So I'm very delighted to pass the mic to Jane and Sarah, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Rachel. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with everybody today, isn't it, Jane?
Absolutely, really looking forward to sharing this session with you.
Fantastic. So for those of you, if you're interested to follow along with the slides and the materials that we'll be working through today, a link to a blog post that contains the downloadable slides will hopefully be being posted into chat for you at the moment. Just a heads up to the team, I don't appear to have permission to be able to send something to everybody. So if the team behind the scenes can post that link into the chat, that would be absolutely fantastic. So with regards to what we're going to go through today, and I'm going to start resharing my screen at the moment, Jane and I, we're going to work through 5 key sections over the course of the next 40-50 minutes or so. And we're going to start off by asking, well, what do we really mean by a sustainable future? What does that look like, and what kind of guidance and expectations are out there in the world at the moment to help us align as to what does sustainability really mean? We're then going to take a look at, well, what do we mean by risk management? And this is going to be led by the lovely Jane, who is, as you just heard from Rachel, a fabulous accountant. And so she's going to be able to translate some of what I will say from my world of geology and sustainability into the world of numbers, money, and finance. And so we'll take a look at what do we actually mean by truly integrated risk management. We'll then go into a really practical session on scenario analysis and how different organisations make use of it to really look at things like scenario analysis with regards to how climate change may impact on their businesses, be it with regards to physical effects of climate change or other effects of climate change, such as the instigation of carbon pricing or changes in regulations. And then finally, we're going to look at, okay, so how do we optimize all of this for a sustainable future? Because all of us want to be around for future generations, or certainly we want our children to be around for future generations. So how do we try and make sure that this truly becomes a reality? So with that, just to test that the questions are working, if all of you can go into the chat or into the questions, just like we showed you earlier, and perhaps write down where in the world you are dialing in from. So that will just allow us to see where in the world you're dialing in from. And so therefore we can tailor some of our comments and some of our stories to you. So perhaps they resonate a little bit more. So we'll just let those come in on the questions whilst I get started with the first section, which is what do we actually mean by a sustainable future? So what does this look like? So sustainability has been around for many thousands of years, okay? This is nothing new. But if we go back to the 1980s, and indeed 1987, the United Nations convened a group of people that put together a fantastic paper that was called Our Common Future. Now, within this paper, they defined sustainable development as being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, that definition still holds true today. We can, of course, challenge it and say it's not just about compromising future generations, it's about actually optimizing what we have now. So it really does deliver true value for the future. So we're looking at this in a variety of different ways. Now, when we're trying to measure sustainability, this is where people generally talk about the 3 Ps. So many of you will recognize people, planet, and profit. And these 3 Ps were put in place back in the 1990s, with people talking about the social aspects of sustainability, planet talking more about the environmental aspects, and then profit. Profit is the difficult one, because sometimes people think that profit is just about money, whereas actually in the world of sustainability, it's more about the sharing of wealth and the distribution of wealth. And in fact, perhaps it is more about the prosperity of different groups of people around the world. And so therefore, what you sometimes see organizations doing when they're talking about the 3 Ps, they talk about people, planet, and prosperity, because that word profit can sometimes be quite misleading for what we truly mean by these 3 Ps. So sustainable development, lots of work was done on this in the 1980s. We then have people beginning to talk about the 3 Ps, people, planets, and profit or prosperity in the 1990s. And then, of course, in 2015, we have the launch of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these goals, I'm sure many of you will recognize. Lots of organizations use these, if not just to pick out 1 or 2 and say, hey, our organization can really help the world or our region achieve one of these areas. And the great thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are really broad and they are incredibly ambitious. When these goals were put in place in the year 2015, the target was for them to be achieved by the year 2030. Now, when we look at these, achieving things like no poverty by the year 2030, that is a big ask. Also looking at things like quality education, gender equality, reduced inequalities, peace and justice, life on land, and of course, climate action. Being able to achieve all of this all together is really, really big, but it's something where we need to be able to consider all of these different aspects as a concerted or as an integrated whole. And so sometimes when we look at this, we say, wow, this is huge. Where do I begin with this? And this is where the rise of this thing called ESG has really come to the fore. So ESG, again, it's another acronym that we have to all deal with. It just stands for environment, social, and governance. So that's where the E, the S, and the G come from. And what you can see from this diagram here is that the environment, the social, and the governance are very integrated in terms of how they are dealt with. So you cannot just deal with environment without thinking about the social aspects and without thinking about the governance aspects. You need to be able to deal with them all together. So looking at what we really mean by the environment, the social, and the governance aspects, what we can do is, and I'll let you read through these in the slides in your own time when you go and download them. But from an environmental perspective, we're talking about how are we using the land? What are we doing to try and conserve, if not optimize, the biodiversity that might be found here? How are we dealing with all of the waste that we produce as humans, but also as the broader ecosystems? What about water? Invariably, depending on where we are in the world, we will have too little water, or other parts of the world might have too much water. And what about the quality of that water? Are we contaminating the water that we use, or are we doing a really good job of making sure we keep everything as clean as possible? And then, of course, I can't talk about environment without mentioning climate change and, of course, weather, because this is one of the areas where we're seeing incredibly huge levels of change with regards to what is going on our planet. So these are the kind of things that we think about when we think about environmental aspects. And what about the social aspects? Now, social is really difficult because whereas we can measure things like temperature and volume of water and number of species in the environmental sense, when we try to measure things like expectations for shared value, that becomes really, really difficult because we're dealing with people's perceptions, people's feelings, people's thoughts. And of course, people tend to change what they're thinking or what they believe in, etc. So therefore, when we're trying to understand the social aspect of this, we need to be very broad-minded in terms of, well, how do I measure what is going on here, and also acknowledge the fact that we may never be able to put a true dollar value against some of these aspects. So in the social space, we're talking about shared value, we're talking about local procurement and hiring, we're talking about working with all of those different stakeholders who we may need to consider, and of course looking at different types of social impact that might be seen, be it in a very small community or in an entire national population. So that's environment and social. And third, we have governance. Now, governance perhaps is the most difficult for people to get their minds around, because governance means two things. It means both corporate governance, so how do we run our organizations? What kind of culture do we instill within our organizations? And how do we hold different people at different levels to account with regards to what they are delivering on? So we have our corporate governance, but then we also have our national and our international governance. So where we look at, okay, so my company might be based in the UK, which is the case for Satala, and so therefore I have to abide by certain British rules and regulations with regards to governance. And that's because it's entrenched within law within the country in which I'm based. Now, of course, every country around the world has their own view of governance and their own methodologies with regards to how they enforce this. So therefore, when we're looking at governance for an organization, we need to be considering both our internal corporate governance, but then also the governance environment in which our organization sits. So we've got our environment, we've got our social, and we've got our governance. And with regards to this, traditionally, we used to deal with each of these separately. But what's been happening increasingly over the last few years is we begin to look at these as an interconnected, because we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, every single one of them are interconnected. So for example, if all we cared about was climate change, that would be fine. But if we got it wrong, we are going to potentially negatively impact on things like poverty, having enough food to eat, etc. So we need to be looking at sustainability as an integrated whole. In fact, when we look at this for an organization, we need to be integrating that ESG, or that sustainability, in with our financial management, in with our technical management, in with our reputation management. We need to look at all of this as an interconnected network. And that is exactly what risk management does, which is what Jane is going to talk to us about very, very shortly. So why are we talking about this with so much passion and so much excitement? Well, back at COP26 in November last year in Glasgow, Mark Carney, so this is Mark Carney standing up, and this is a picture that I took, so therefore I own this picture. So I took this picture, and he stood up and he said that every financial decision needs to take climate change into account. Now, whilst of course COP26 was primarily talking about climate change, they were really, and this was what was going on behind the scenes, they were really talking about all of sustainability. So yes, when we talk climate change, it is about trying to work out how do we minimize the amount by which our temperature, our global temperature, is going to go up, but we need to be going to be talking about primarily today. Now, the good news is that there's lots of rules and guidance that's been published over the last few years to help us with this. And in fact, I mean, you just need to search for it and there will be a new piece of guidance that's been published every week at the moment, some of which pertain very explicitly to certain regions of the world, and others, for example, might just talk about things like carbon pricing. So there's lots and lots there. And perhaps the most talked about piece of guidance at the moment with regards to climate change is this thing called TCFD. Okay, now TCFD just stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And it is what is being used within, say, the UK, within Europe, and versions of it is now permeating across the world. But all of those aspects of guidance and regulation all tend to say the same thing with regards to looking at climate change and integrating the impacts of that climate change into our financial modelling and our financial reporting. That is what TCFD is asking for. Now, when we take a look at TCFD, this diagram, and don't worry, you don't need to read the text here, but basically it consists of 4 key parts: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So it's got 4 component parts that, to be honest, are just normal business as usual, but I'm not trying to belittle TCFD in any way at all. But within this, if you start reading it, you very quickly notice that the words risks, including both threats and opportunities, are mentioned more times in this one diagram than you would typically find in an entire risk management procedure for your organization. The people who have written and put together TCFD are really hammering home the fact that we truly need to understand risk management and how to use it to ensure we manage those potential uncertainties within our organization. So with that, I'm going to hand across to the lovely Jane Waldy to take us through, so what on earth do we mean by risk management? Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So what on earth do we mean by risk management? Well, risk means different things to different people. So when I first worked as an accountant, I understood risks to be very much negative things, and I was most interested in those risks that I might need to put a provision in the accounts for. So let's have a look and see what people who work in those ESG spaces think of risk. If you're an environmentalist, you're going to think of risk in terms of how are we impacting the environment that we're working in. So as Sarah was pointing out in her slides, perhaps how are we affecting the water supply where we're operating? What damage might we be doing to the environment? Social person also is interested in materiality, but they're interested in perhaps the impacts we're having on the local communities where we're operating. How might we be affecting those communities either in a good way or a bad way? People who work in governance, they're probably most interested in compliance related risks. Are we actually complying to the rules and the regulations that we need to? But the point here is that we're all actually connected. So if I needed to make a provision in the accounts because the company that I was working for was polluting some land, I would need to go and talk to the environmentalist to really understand that impact assessment. So I knew what basis I had for making that provision. But it doesn't stop there. We've got a number of specialists within our organisation, and they all view risks slightly differently through different aspects of what they do. And it's not unless you can really understand all these different perspectives, can you truly understand your network or risk profile. So your risk profile is a network of risks, but we do this through enterprise risk management. So it's really important that we have risk management running throughout the organisation so that we can get a handle on what this network of risk looks like. And we also probably need a definition of risk that we can all actually hang our hats on and really understand. So our international standard says that risk is the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. So in other words, what is going to really matter to you that's going to help or hinder you in meeting your objectives? And so it's really important to notice that I said help there, because risk is not just downside, it's both opportunity and threat. And when you're managing the uncertainties around your opportunities, you're going to get the total value of your risk management activities. So we have a lovely, easy 4-step process that we use for enterprise-wide risk management. And it goes like this. So we start by understanding our context. what is happening in the wider world around us and what's happening inside our organisation that might make it easier or more difficult to meet our objectives. We need to be really clear about our objectives. Where are we going? What do we want to change in the world? Because this clarity about our objectives then means that the uncertainties that we want to dig into will be relevant to our organisation. So once we've understood our context and objectives, we're going to then move to the second steps, which is to assess our risks. And this consists of risk identification. We need to then understand those risks a bit better, maybe looking at causes and impacts. And then we're going to evaluate those risks. And that evaluation should answer the question of, do these risks that we've identified actually really matter to us? And if the answer is yes, then we move to step 3, which is risk management. Easy way to remember risk management is the 5 T's. So the first T is we're going to tolerate a risk. It could be that you've found a risk that matters, but you've decided that actually you don't need to do anything about it because you're either managing it to a level that you're comfortable with already, or perhaps you've got a very strong balance sheet, so you don't need to worry about that risk. So that's tolerate. The next T is transfer through insurance or contracting out to a third party. Third T is terminate. This normally relates to those compliance type risks. So if you'll find that you're breaking a law in a certain part of the world, you're obviously going to want to stop doing that. But this also relates to your ethics and values as a corporate. If you're operating in ways which are against those stated values, then you need to really make sure that you stop doing those activities because they're actually outside your risk appetite. So the fourth T is putting management controls in place. And those management controls really need to change that risk in some way, because if they're not changing the risk, then that control is not effective. The other really important thing to notice as accountants is that all controls for risks require resource. So there's a link there to budgeting. So if you're allocating budget, or indeed if you're cutting budget, those people who understand those risks, because you need to understand the risk implication of cutting or allocating that budget. Because if the budget is cut too much and you don't have the resources to hold your risks to the level that you want to, that means that you may not be able to meet your business objectives. So those are the sorts of conversations that we should be having around risk as accountants in our day-to-day. Fifth T, take a risk. Example here could be that you're a publicly listed company, you're acquiring another publicly listed company, and you can't exchange all the information you would like to in your due diligence process because you're both at the time pre-acquisition, you're competitors, so you're legally not allowed to exchange that information. But you're going to take that risk because you think the acquisition is actually going to be worth it and the reward is worth it. So having decided what you're going to do to manage your risks, you're then going to go to step 4, which is monitor, review and report. You're going to want to monitor how you are managing your risks. So checking that you're doing what you say you're going to do and you're taking the actions that you've said you're going to take around your risks. You're going to monitor that, but you're also going to want to monitor your context and your objectives. As we've observed recently, your context, particularly your external context, can change very, very quickly. And you need to be able to respond to that. And you respond to it by restarting that process again, because if your context has changed, that should trigger this whole process again. The review and report side then fits into this governance aspect. You need to really understand as an organisation what's happening throughout your organisation using this 4-step process, but also then actually really getting an understanding of what that risk profile looks like so you can make your external disclosures. And so, as Sarah was saying, you need to involve this 4-step process as a mechanism where all these specialists can actually begin to talk to each other. Because if we have this 4-step process as a common understanding of risk, we can all then dovetail any specialism that we might have around risk management into this 4-step process at any level of the organisation. And so really making the point as well that if you're not looking at these environmental, social and governance issues when you're making these risk assessments, then you're not getting the full risk profile of your company. Because as we've said before, risks are networked. And so if you're just focusing on your commercial side, those risks that you might not be managing today around environmental, social and government might come back to really haunt you in years to come. And this also just sort of picks up on the point that risks materialize at different times. So they materialize in the short, medium and long term. And these ESG type risks are what we call slow burners. So they might be materializing further out in time than you're normally looking at. It can be typical for companies to look at risks over their planning periods, say 2 or 3 years. But with ESG, we need to look out much, much further over a longer timeline. Because as we've said before, in fact, I think we've said it quite a few times now in the presentation, your risks are networked. And again, those risks that might materialize in the short or medium term around ESG that aren't being managed are going to have a much bigger impact because they will be connected potentially to those ESG risks that materialize later.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Jane. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, if everybody would just like to write into chat the methodology and the overview with regards to enterprise risk management that Jane's just given us, is that how you do risk management in your organization, or do you do it differently? So do you include a network of risks? Are you including all of those ESG risks alongside your financial risks, or do you do it in a different manner? So that would be really interesting for us to know. So if you want to add that into chat, please do go for it. And also if you have any questions, please do pop them into the question box, or of course put them into chat. It doesn't matter, we'll be able to see all of those coming through as well. So as you can see here, everything is networked, everything happens over time, and to be honest, we don't really know what the future holds. So this is where using scenario analysis as a tool really begins to help us. So what do we mean by scenario analysis? So scenario analysis is a method through which we explore a number of plausible stories, really, through which we may see some form of impact on our organization. Okay, so the key word here is plausible. So we're not talking alien invasion, but we are saying, well, the temperature in the world may go up by 4 degrees, etc. So what does that actually mean for us? Also, as well, we're talking about a path of a development leading to a particular outcome. That's what we actually mean by a scenario. And key with regards to this is that a scenario is not a forecast or a prediction of the future, and shouldn't only be used for the most likely outcome, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to push ourselves to imagine potential futures. Now, Jane, do you want to say anything with regards to the word forecast?
Yeah, so just because our audience is accountants and we'll be used to forecasting figures, so just that point that at this stage of the game, when we're looking at risks, a scenario is not a prediction, as you said, but what we're doing is we're looking at potential future states. So looking at that diagram there are 3 different sort of highlighted paths of what our scenario could look like, and then there is confusingly perhaps a connection back into this when we start looking at the accounting and measuring side of these scenarios. So you might want to work this into a financial forecast, but we're going to look at perhaps how the devil might be in the detail for that later on. So I just wanted to clarify that point. I hope it has clarified rather than confused.
Thank you, Jane, it's great. So a scenario is a plausible story of what might happen in the future, and we tend to use scenario analysis basically when full-scale uncertainty modelling is either too hard or too expensive, i.e. when there is a huge amount of uncertainty with regards to what we're looking at, or if what we're looking at is incredibly complicated, is a very complex situation. And so therefore, some examples of this, we tend to use scenario analysis when we're doing our long-term strategy and planning. We tend to use it when we're going through or we're planning for some form of transformational project. And then, of course, when we're starting to talk about climate. So when we're looking at a scenario, a good scenario should ideally be plausible, distinctive, consistent, relevant, challenging for the organization. Ideally, it should integrate all relevant perspectives and knowledge. So bearing in mind that different people within your organization or outside of your organization may have conflicting perspectives with regards to that, and that needs to be acknowledged. And then finally, we need to show where that impact could be on your organization, be that impact financial, reputational, technological, etc. It doesn't really matter, but we need to say where that impact would be. Now, many different scenario analysis tools exist. And going back to this diagram that Jane showed us earlier, within the world of finance, we have some standard ways of looking at scenario analysis. And the problem is that if you then go and speak to an environmental expert, they will do it in a different way, and they will use slightly different language, which will be different to the social expert, which will be different to the lawyer. And so what we need to be thinking about is, okay, we need to be able to align all of these individuals and harvest all the information out of their heads in the nicest possible way to say, what do we think these scenarios might be? So in general, there are two kind of different ways of doing scenario analysis. The first is to say, okay, what does the world look like now? And perhaps build a bit of a model and then project that model into the future. So we then run that model and see how all those different factors change through time. And this is what we're generally doing if we create things like influence or causal maps, and also if we do our normal stress testing. So if we take our costs model for our organization and we know what it looks like today, we know what it looked like last year and the year before because we had to disclose on it through our annual reports. And then what we say is, okay, now project that into the future. What does that look like? And we can stress test different factors within those models. So that today, looking forward, is one way of doing scenario analysis. The other way of doing scenario analysis is where we project ourselves into the future. Okay, so unfortunately, we have not developed time travel yet, so we can't actually go there and then look backwards. So instead, we just have to use our imaginations and say, okay, I am now here in 2050. What does the world look like? And how did I get here? And so we use things like horizon scanning. We can use different prescribed scenarios, and we use things like pre and pro-mortems. Now, Jane, I know that pre and pro-mortems are your favorite. Do you want to quickly describe them?
Yes, very briefly, a pre-mortem is to get your senior management team together in a room and ask them to think the unthinkable. Think that maybe in 10 years' time, they're sitting there and the company has failed catastrophically. And you ask them to think of all the reasons why it might have failed. And this should include things like market disruptors. And quite often this then leads to a really good strategic conversation of how your strategy should be changing in order to optimize those things that you can perceive that might happen in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
There I
go, Jane, go on.
that was it. That was it.
Cool. So this is great. So what we have here is we have a whole variety of different methodologies that we can use. And with all of this, it therefore means that we can bring in lots of different perspectives from teams round about us, which, just looking at your answers in the chat now to our previous question, some of you have got risk management that does include ESG, whereas some of the rest of you have got risk management that currently is only really focused on the finance side. So a nice way to broaden that finance management or that risk management perhaps is to start using some of these different tools and techniques, because then the people who are experts in sustainability will find it easier to engage with you and provide you with the information you perhaps need to better understand those areas of risk. So that's fantastic, and thank you very much for that information you put into the chat. So in terms of the scenario analysis, and specifically with regards to climate change, where of course there's been a huge amount of development over the last few years, and this is where, warning, there's a whole load of acronyms on this slide, but basically there have been lots of developments going on. Starts with the G20, then we go into the Financial Stability Board, into the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and then to this thing called NGFS. Now, what happened back in 2020 was all of the big central banks got together and they said, okay, let's put together some guidance for different organizations around the world for the network for greening the financial system. Okay, terrible title, but actually the information that is contained within this documentation is really useful. And sitting behind the scenes is a huge amount of data that is freely available. And if you dig for it enough, you can then use this data for free to say, how do I think that the climate may vary in my part of the world? So there's lots of freely available data through NGFS that is available for you to use. Now, one of the key things that NGFS put together were a number of scenarios. And these main scenarios here, they look at the physical risks versus transition risks. Okay, so these are physical risks are the temperature going up and sea level going up, for example. Transition risks are things like carbon pricing, changing in regulation. And what we have here is we have a difference between a hothouse world, a disorderly transition, and an orderly transition. Now, these three scenarios, and of course we can also look at too little too late, but that's incredibly depressing for all of us. So these four scenarios that we have here are really quite standard. And what you will find is that a lot of organizations will take these four different scenarios as articulated within NGFS and say, okay, if in 30 years' time we're living in a hothouse world, what does that mean for us? And what could we as an organization have done to make sure we minimize any threats that would be posed to us and maximize any opportunities that this change poses to us as well? Because of course, with any change comes massive opportunity for all of us, which is really exciting. So with all of this, what most organizations do is they take these recognized scenarios and they mix them with their own context and their own risks. And that therefore allows you to have your own bespoke scenarios for your climate change risk management. Okay, so that's what you're doing here. Is you're taking international good practice and you're mixing it with your own context. If all you did was take the international best practice, you'd be missing out on lots of the important factors that are absolutely critical for your part of the world, for your industry in which you work. So therefore, you need to be able to bring both of them together. Now, with regards to doing this, we've got three very simple options that we're going to float past you now. The first one is keeping it super easy, and it's just having a conversation. And so what we do with this is we say, okay, as an individual, what would the hothouse world look like for our organization? And what you do is you get a variety of different people from just different disciplines in the room or on the video conference, and you have that discussion. And you say, what would the world look like for us if we were in a hothouse world? And what kind of action could we be taking now? What kind of changes could we instigate within our strategy that will optimize our position with regards to this particular scenario? So option one, super easy, have a conversation. And this is what a lot of organizations are doing at the moment. And this is good enough. The key thing, though, is recording the actions that arise from this conversation. So you need to do something with it, not just have the conversation. The second option that we've got for you is a little bit more complex, but perhaps a little bit more structured. And what we do here is we use a graph where we compare potential impact of a risk on our objectives against whether any action is needed with regards to that risk. So, for example, if we have a risk that could have a really big impact on what we're trying to do, but we can't do anything about it, or maybe we don't want to do anything about it, it would be positioned here in the bottom right-hand corner, in where we say there's no action that's needed. However, if we have another risk, which could have a very high impact on what we're doing, where we feel it's totally out of control and we need to take lots of action, it goes up in the top right-hand corner. And we can begin to build all of this up. And then we can instigate arrows, all of which say, right, I need to have done something. I need to have taken action in order to be able to move these risks around to show that I'm actually managing this situation. This form of risk prioritization is much more common across the world now compared to impact against likelihood, which is the traditional way of doing risk management. So just to highlight here that you can use different dashboards, different visualization tools that enact the discussion around change and action rather than just which are my big scary risks that I need to be considering. So with this, what you can then do is you say, okay, so here is my base case for an organization. Now let's instigate future scenario 1 and future scenario 2. Given those, what kind of management options might I be able to put in place? And so therefore, through all of this, no matter if the future is scenario 1 or scenario 2 or a mixture of both, what I can decide is actually management strategy C gives me the best bang for my buck. And so therefore, I can make sure that I can manage as many of these risks down to below that dashed line, so that area where we can tolerate those risks, as far as possible. Now, Jane, I know you have a little example for us.
Yes, so our organisation has a data centre in India, and we know that India produces about 60% of its energy from fossil fuels. So we've got quite a large carbon footprint. And what we're doing about that carbon footprint at the moment is we're offsetting it with carbon credits. Now we're going to have a look at a couple of scenarios. So this is our base case that we got on the left. And then our scenario 1 is an orderly transition. And what that means is that price for those carbon offsets is going to go up very soon in the future. And it's also going to rise exponentially because everybody is going to want those carbon credits. The second scenario is a hothouse. So as the climate warms, the demand for energy to cool the systems is going to go up and up. So you're going to need more energy to cool your systems. And then eventually, as the communities in India need more and more energy to cool their houses, then we're going to find in our scenario that the energy grid can't keep up. So we're going to have power outages and we're going to have business interruption as a result of that. So those are our two scenarios. You can see how our risk profile changes. We've got some management options then. What are we going to do? What actions can we take against those scenarios? Number one, we can continue to buy those carbon credits and just swallow that cost. That's great. However, it's not going to do anything about our business resilience. But we can see what our risk profiles look like. Option 2, we can move the data center elsewhere. But what about all those people that we employ in India? If you're looking after those social uncertainties, you're going to have risks there really coming up quite high that you're still going to need to manage. Option C, let's see what our risk profiles look like if we install solar panels on that data center roof. Well, we can automatically see that under both scenarios, this is actually the best solution. And so as accountants, this is great because we may not need to financially model all those options because we're now looking at those options from a risk perspective and we can see which one is the best option because that's not only going to reduce our costs of carbon credits, it's going to keep our people in India employed and it's also going to make us much more resilient as a business. So that's
brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Jane. Great. So what you can see here is a very simple tool being used to model out some of those scenarios. Now you can do this just by moving post-it notes or things around in the PowerPoint presentation, or you can do it by sticking some numbers in behind the scenes, which gently takes us into option 3, which is where we break out those spreadsheets. And so this is something where, say, for example, we put together some form of causal map or influence map. What we will often do, especially in the world of finance, is put all of this into a lovely spreadsheet. Now, we've intentionally kept the font really small, so you can't see what we've written here, because otherwise all of you will start looking at it and say, oh, how is that being done? But the key thing with regards to this, and this comes back to one of the questions that was asked in the chat, which is a great question around how do we actually quantify and value ESG? Fabulous question. And this is a case where the world of finance and accountancy is saving the day. Having been a professional who's worked in the world of sustainability for many years, lots of people were like, oh yes, that's really important. But actually you never saw the reflection of good sustainability practice in an organization's share price or in an investor saying, yes, we want to go and invest in that particular organization. This is now beginning to change because every organization is beginning to have to disclose on how are they managing things like climate change with regards to the financial resilience of their organization. So A, we're having to get this disclosure of this information. B, investors are increasingly unable to invest in an organization unless they can see that you take ESG seriously and you have an ESG or a sustainability strategy that you are actually putting in place. So this is coming very, very quickly down the pipeline at the moment. We're seeing the rise of green finance, green bonds, all of this that requires sustainability and ESG credentials to be in place at the moment. So we're seeing this massive shift at the moment. And of course, whilst of course the price of oil and gas is doing all kinds of funny things because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, the overarching trend with regards to this is this move from oil and gas across into renewables. And we see a lot of these strategies playing out in the Middle East at the moment, especially with regards to the shift to look for the minerals and metals within the land, not just the oil and gas. So looking for the minerals and metals that are needed for wind turbines, for example. So on a very big macro scale, we can see this shift. And then when it comes into the strategic planning and the financial impact of all of these different risks related to climate change, the mechanisms through which you can actually place value on them are beginning to come through, either because you just won't have access to the cash, or because things like carbon pricing is becoming a reality increasingly so. If you are an American organization, for example, the predictions by all of those big banks is that by 2030, there will be a carbon price of between $100 and $200 per ton of carbon that's emitted. Now, when you start working that into your financial models, it kills some businesses because they can't afford to pay $100 per ton of carbon that they produce and still be liquid as a company. So this is something where by bringing in carbon pricing, and you can do this through a variety of different mechanisms, through bringing in the cost of access to water, through bringing in, if the temperature goes up, how much air conditioning are you going to have in your facilities? All of these different aspects, now you are expected to roll them into your financial models as a business. And that therefore allows you to begin to put a dollar value or whatever value on ESG as an organization. And it's often done by beginning to roll in the spreadsheets. So you begin to put some numbers in place. So just to conclude on this and come into our final section here. So how do we optimize the scenario analysis for a sustainable future, seeing as that was our exam question at the beginning? Well, it is all about taking action. So making sure this truly does go into your strategy, because then those green investors will be able to say, oh yes, actually you do care about this and I can see you enacting it. Okay, yes, here, take our investment money. So you're beginning to see all of this begin to roll into place. What people are also doing is they're looking at their full enterprise. So not just their core activities, they're also looking at their inputs. So where do we get our materials from, and are we influencing them with regards to their carbon footprint and their ESG footprint? Also, where does our material go to? So what about the downstream impact of all of this? And then finally, what about the external influences, everything else that's going on in the world? How could this be impacting on what we do as an organization? And where can we truly take advantage of this big shift towards sustainability, which is here and it's happening at the moment? Another hint for you is if you go into the TCFD documentation and you're thinking, I've got no idea what my risks might be with regards to climate change. Well, TCFD tells you what they might be. Okay, so this is incredibly useful guidance, be it in terms of the transition risks or the physical risks, but then also some of those upsides. So not just the threats, we're also looking at the opportunities with regards to this as well. And the final hint here is that integration is the key. You need to be able to see your risks in your organization as a network. And remember that one person's risk might be somebody else's cause, might be somebody else's consequence, might be somebody else's opportunity, might be somebody else's threat. So how do you integrate all of this together? And so finally, just to leave 5 minutes for questions, Rachel, you'll be delighted to hear. In conclusion, even if the impact that we're focused on is financial, we still need to look at those other aspects of impact, especially when we're looking at the social aspects of all of this. It can be incredibly difficult to pinpoint what that financial value might be. And what is a good way of approaching this is to say, I'm not just looking for one number, I'm happy to accept a range of numbers, because your confidence in what that central number might be very weak. But actually, if you start saying, well, it could be from between here to there, that then allows you to model the impact or the potential impact of a lot of these aspects with a far greater degree of certainty that can be much more useful when you're trying to work out, okay, do we spend the cash on moving the plant from that area to that area so it won't be affected by sea level or not? So you need to be able to bring in these ranges and to look at both the environment and the social aspects, not just the financial aspects. With regards to emissions, because lots of people are talking about greenhouse gas emissions at the moment, and there's a lot of focus in on measuring them. So how much carbon dioxide or NOx or SOx, etc., are we pushing up into the atmosphere? It's not just what those emissions are, it is what are we doing about it. So how are we minimizing those emissions where possible? And also thinking about carbon sequestration. So can we suck some of that carbon out of the air and pump it underground? And in the Middle East, we've got fabulous infrastructure to do this, because we've spent many years sucking carbon out of the ground to use for energy. We've got the infrastructure, and what's happening in the North Sea, for example, at the moment, is people are just reversing the flow of that gas and pushing it back underground again, therefore instigating value in all of that infrastructure that perhaps was just something that was needed for decommissioning in the past. So huge opportunity that's there. Also, once you understand your scenarios, you need to work out where the action is. So what are people going to do with regards to all of this? Action is really, really important. And finally, your enterprise risk management, so that interconnection of all of those different aspects, is absolutely vital to test your strategy and make sure that what you are stating publicly is actually achievable and you can show how you are going to do it. So the final couple of slides is where we say a massive thank you to the ACCA, because look, the ACCA is using the Sustainable Development Goals, which is brilliant, and there's a call to action. So if you want to look at an organisation that is already doing this, then you don't need to look any further because it's already here. So with that, thank you very, very much. We do have a couple of minutes for some extra questions, but if any of you do want to get in touch with either Jane or myself, please do feel free to reach out and we'd be delighted to answer your questions in an offline forum. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll pass back to Rachel to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane and Sarah. As always, it's so enlightening and very topical. I hope the audience enjoyed, and I hope they do get in touch with you if they have any further questions, because I don't see that many. I think you addressed them already. I wonder though, is there...
Sorry to interrupt you mid-flow. There was one in the questions that I picked up on, and that's, when can we expect the impact on carbon costs to impact the Middle East? So Sarah, I've got a view on this. Whilst we can't predict rules and regulations, obviously in local regions, I would say that looking at that wider context, if the cost of carbon goes up exponentially in the rest of the world, that's going to impact what your customers can afford, and therefore it's going to impact your demand. That would be my take. Sarah, any views?
Yes, and I think, this is something where when you look at those, the NGFS, the Network for Greening Financial Scenarios, when you look at those scenarios, what they have is different speeds at which that carbon cost is going to come into place in different parts of the world. And there are actually, again, some freely available data sets out there where you can say, okay, so if I'm in Saudi Arabia or Oman or Dubai or wherever, what do people think in terms of the level of carbon price now versus 2030 versus 2050? What do I think it might look like? And this is handy, especially if you have a business that operates in different parts of the world, because it will give you what the carbon cost looks like for Mali, for Thailand, for the US. And that's important because when you are trying to ship a product from one jurisdiction to another, if that first jurisdiction doesn't have a carbon price, you it's likely that there will be some form of tax that will be applied to it. So if you are shipping product into the European Union, for example, they will start charging a carbon price with regards to that product if it hasn't already been charged earlier. That makes sense. So you have to be thinking about when will the carbon pricing be coming in where you are operating, but then also thinking about your supply chain and what kind of carbon price may be incorporated into all of that as well. All of that's being worked out at the moment. Good question though, thank you.
Great question.
I think before we draw it to an end, it would be really interesting if people in the audience can say what role they play, if they're coming from the CFO seat, a head of audit, or where they are in the company, and who owns that sustainability. I mean, we really all do, but maybe you both can talk about who you guys deal with, client-wise within the organization, and in terms of getting that buy-in, like we talked about a couple of days ago.
Yeah, sure. So when we're working with organizations to help them, be it on the risk management side or the incorporation of sustainability into that decision making, we will get phone calls from everybody, from the chairperson of the organization, because this is very much within the board's accountability, through to the CEO and the CFO. The CFOs are very concerned with all of this at the moment, because often incorporating climate change into the financial models is something that's quite new, and so lots of people are looking for support there. But then also the chief risk officers on the CRO side, that's something where if the risk management within the organization doesn't quite encompass all of this yet, or perhaps is struggling to say what is the financial impact of some of these risks. So you may have ESG risks already within that profile, but it's the impact of them, and then also the rolling into the strategy and the governance of the organization. That's often where we get the phone call from the CROs. And then finally, we often get phone calls from the sustainability team, because they are the experts when it comes to the environment and the social and the governance aspects, but they're not experts when it comes to understanding the financial impacts of all of these. So what you have here is that often will act as that bridge or that translator between the environmental experts and the financial experts within the organization to say, how do we actually stitch all of this together? Jane, would you agree with that?
Yes, I'd agree with that. And I'd expand a little as well, because I think that what we're probably going to see with this financial disclosures that are going to be required is that you've got your traditional way of looking at your accounts, which generally obviously looks back at your results, okay, with some estimates perhaps in there. And then you will probably have a number of different scenarios that you might have considered. And as Sarah was saying, perhaps with those ranges even included around some of the estimates that you put in those figures, because these are quite uncertain things. And so it'll probably have the usual caveats around forward-looking statements, scenarios, but I would see them as sort of sitting in a separate disclosure to your primary statements. That would be my take on it. It'll be very interesting to see how companies actually do make this work.
Yeah, so as you can see with this at the moment, Rachel, is that there is no set way to do it. So everybody is experimenting, and this is the secret, they're making it up as they go along. Now that is ground shattering or earth shattering for a consultant to admit that, but that is what's going on at the moment, because provided we all are looking at, okay, how do we ensure that we are building that sustainable world for future generations? That is the main objective that we're aiming at here. At the moment, we're looking at all of these different tools, techniques, levers, influencers to say, how are we going to get there? Provided we're all pointed in that direction, then that's fine. And regulators, investors, etc., will all accept what we're doing if they can see tangible progress that is being made. What is not appropriate anymore is for people just to say, oh yes, we're doing wonderful stuff, and then not be able to back it up, because that is greenwashing. So now what people are truly looking for is that impact and that action and that true progress that's being made towards, be it various climate targets or the broader sustainable development goals that we could see earlier on. Thanks, Rachel.
No, that was so well put. With our engagement in members, we see it's very clear it's a journey. It's not something that can happen overnight. And even the ones that have very mature and they're farther down the road, they're still learning. I think a lot of the things you pointed out about collaboration, I see by my discussions with members too, where they might be 18 months into this and they realize that all of the teams aren't working together and they're not looking at, that what you say, well, what are we actually doing now? And I think another thing to end on for our audience is to turn this into an opportunity. There are so many new requirements. It's a big year for implementing regulations that are coming into effect, but it really pays to turn it into an opportunity and to get your teams together and to continuously learning and attending things like this. This is what we want to keep doing for our members, not least in the Middle East. So I would like to thank you guys both so much. And I hope that our audience, if they do have any questions or other topics that they feel that they would like to us to address in this region for future workshops, please do let us know. So if there are no more questions, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.